I live with my son, so you need to leave. Suddenly, my mother-in-law I'm living with threw those cold words at me. I thought I have always been good to my mother-in-law. I've always tried to make sure she didn't have any inconveniences, but it seems my mother-in-law never noticed. There have been times when my mother-in-law treated me poorly, and I have grown resentful of her. Finally, I was like, I'll gladly leave. I haven't intended to say that, but I thought that was probably how I truly felt. My husband is away on a business trip. The only one who'd be in trouble if I left would be my mother-in-law. The luxurious life she's been enjoying in the city is because of me. Had my mother-in-law forgotten that? With these thoughts, I've decided to leave the house. My name is Catherine. I'll be turning 38 this year. My husband and I have been married for 10 years, and we both work. We once considered having children, but the doctor told me it would be difficult for me to conceive. I was told natural conception was nearly impossible, and we considered fertility treatments. However, after many discussions, my husband and I decided not to have children and to enjoy our lives together. Then, my father-in-law got sick and passed away. My mother-in-law had bad knees and living alone in the family home was tough. We thought about hiring a caregiver, but for safety reasons, it seemed best if she lived with us. We were planning to build a house at that time, so we designed it with a room for my mother-in-law in mind. For her convenience, given my mother-in-law's bad knees, we installed a small bathroom, kitchen, and toilet on the first floor. On the second floor, we have our own bathroom and kitchen, thinking my mother-in-law would be comfortable. Though it went over our budget, we felt it was the best decision considering my mother-in-law comfort. It showed our consideration and kindness. But it seemed my mother-in-law didn't see it that way. I could tell from my mother-in-law's behavior since she started living with us. I never had a bad impression of her before, but recently she's become more aggressive toward me. Moreover, my mother-in-law always becomes more aggressive when my husband's not at home. My husband is in sales, and recently he's been traveling abroad more often. While he used to have day trips frequently, it's different with overseas trips. He often stays away for about a week per trip. That very day, my husband mentioned he'd be on an international business trip for about a week. After sending my husband off early in the morning, I began getting ready for work. Suddenly, I heard my mother-in-law's loud voice from downstairs. "Hey! Come down here right now." Wondering what the fuss was about, I quickly headed to the first floor, but everything looked normal. My mother-in-law was just sitting in the living room, watching TV. I had assumed there was some sort of emergency. Then she was like, "Why are you just standing there? Hurry up and make my breakfast." I had never prepared breakfast for my mother-in-law before, as my husband and I both have full-time jobs and she always made her own. I wondered what had changed. Maybe she wasn't feeling well? I suggested she might need to see a doctor, but she was like, "I'm perfectly fine. Can't you see? Shouldn't my son's wife take care of me? I've heard other households serve a 3-course breakfast every morning." Turns out, the family she was referring to lives together just like us, but the wife is a homemaker. So, she prepares meals 3 times a day. I tried to explain that my husband and I both work, so it's impossible for me to cook in the mornings or midday, but my mother-in-law just turned the TV volume up in frustration. I figured she didn't want to hear what I had to say, so I decided not to say anything more. That day, after finishing work and returning home, I found my mother-in-law waiting for dinner. I made lasagna that my mother-in-law loves, but she was like, "What's this? It's way too salty," and threw all the food I prepared into the trash. After that incident, my mother-in-law became very domineering, constantly picking on me and nitpicking everything I did. When things got unbearable, I confided in a friend who suggested it might be bullying by mother-in-law. Upon researching online, I found numerous similar stories from other my mother-in-laws. As my mother-in-law's behavior continued to worsen, I decided to have a heart-to-heart conversation with her. I took a day off from work and approached her during the day. I was like, "Hey, why have you suddenly started acting so hostile? We've always lived in harmony. If I've done something wrong, let me know." But if you don't talk to me, I won't know how to make things right." However, she didn't seem interested in listening. When I patiently faced my mother-in-law, she eventually started to speak. Apparently, she had become envious after hearing about a family she'd talked about some time ago. In that family, there are 2 kids, a daughter and a son, and the couple lives with the husband's parents. Their home is more spacious than ours, and she's envious because they have coffee with many guests. She mentioned that she wished to spend her retirement in such a manner. Our home isn't necessarily small. In our neighborhood, it's actually considered quite large. We have a backyard big enough for barbecue parties, and I told her we could host home parties without any issues. But she felt inferior and believed she couldn't compete, hence not inviting anyone over. Our conversation didn't conclude with any resolution. However, a few days later, an incident occurred. As I was leaving for work, a lady from across the street was staring at me. Moreover, I noticed people whispering and glancing my way elsewhere. Wondering if there was something odd about my attire or makeup, I checked but found nothing amiss. I discovered the reason for the whispers that evening. On my way home from work, one of the neighbors approached me and said, "Hey, I've heard some rumors, violence ain't right." Violence? I was taken aback. Digging deeper, the rumor was that I had become violent with my mother-in-law. It was said that the confrontation took place on the day we had that discussion and that I even told her to leave if she continued with her lavish lifestyle. I have no memory of doing such a thing and had no intentions of ever doing so. After explaining, the lady thought for a moment and was like, "If that's true, it's really not good." The whole neighborhood's buzzing with this story. I've heard that she's been approaching others, wanting to discuss it and sharing stories of your alleged violence. For a while, I was labeled in the neighborhood as the violent wife. I managed to bear it until about 5 days after my husband left on a business trip. Finally reaching my breaking point. I felt I needed to talk to my husband first, but I couldn't muster the courage to bother him with this during his busy trip. So, I decided to first communicate my feelings to my mother-in-law. "I've noticed you seem to have taken a disliking to me this past week. You're my husband's mother, and I wanted us to live comfortably together. No matter how hard I try, it seems I can't change how you feel. Perhaps it would be best if we consider living separately." My mother-in-law looked taken aback by my suggestion for a moment, but then she was like, "I agree. I never really liked you from the start. Living in this fancy house on my son's dime and acting as if you've done it all. A woman who doesn't even have kids and only works has little value in my eyes," and scoffed. At that point, I wondered what my mother-in-law was misunderstanding. Because, you see, I bought this house. From the down payment of the mortgage, everything's been on me. I had explained it when we built the house, but I wonder if my mother-in-law has forgotten. Moreover, I'm the one covering the living expenses. My mother-in-law gets an allowance from my husband and spends it carelessly, but that's also coming out of my salary. Even though my husband is working hard, he's not making as much as expected, and his income is lower compared to mine. So, the agreement was that we'd cover our living expenses from my income and save whatever my husband made, since we don't have kids and for our future. Before we moved in together, my husband had explained this to her, and he had warned her not to be wasteful. Ever since my husband left on his business trip, my mother-in-law has been watching TV infomercial every day and making phone calls. She probably ordered something. As I was thinking about all this, she started saying things like, she was like, "I'm gonna live here with my son. You should leave. I'll discuss the rest with my son. If my son wants, you might even consider a divorce. So, be prepared for that." At this point, I realized it's useless to argue. Once I gave up, I was like, "I'll gladly leave," quickly packed my largest suitcase, and decided to leave the house with all I could carry. Before leaving, I glanced at my mother-in-law, and she was smirking at me. She laughed aloud and was like, "Oh, leaving so soon? That's not too bad of you, but maybe you could be a bit more charming?" Honestly, I don't remember doing anything to upset my mother-in-law this much. Whenever my mother-in-law asked for a ride, I would provide one. I tried my best to spend time with her, so she wouldn't feel lonely. We haven't given her the joy of grandkids, and I work. However, that's the life choice we made as a couple, and my mother-in-law has no right to dictate that. As anger surged within me, I thought my mother-in-law'd be the one regretting this in the end. With that thought, I left the house with my heavy luggage. When told to leave, I wondered where I'd go. My childhood home is a plane ride away, and I couldn't abandon my job. Also, I didn't want to worry my parents. The first place that came to mind was my office. I run my own business, a small cafe. I employ 2 students as part-time, but primarily I manage it on my own. The cafe is in a 1-story house, with the extra space used as an office and storage. Though it's a small house, there's enough space for someone to live. I usually drove from home to the office, but living at the office would cut down the commute. Now, I won't need to cook for my mother-in-law anymore, which means more time for work. As someone passionate about my job, I got excited thinking about the extra working hours while setting up a living space in the office. I cleared out the piles of cardboard boxes and decided to sleep on the blanket I had laid out for napping. I also arranged a table and chairs to make work easier. By evening, 2 student part-timers came in for their shifts. They were surprised to see the office looking different, but once I explained the situation, they readily understood. They were even like, "Let us know if you need anything. We'll help out wherever we can." At that moment, I felt grateful for hiring them. They're such kind-hearted individuals, and they've received excellent feedback from our customers. I've been checking the reviews for our cafe daily, and besides the ambience and the quality of food, many patrons praise the service provided by the part-timers. I had been thinking about raising their pay when I received a call from my husband, who was supposed to be on a business trip. I could only check the message around 9 p.m. My husband mentioned he got home earlier than expected. However, upon arriving, he noticed a lot of my belongings were missing. He confronted my mother-in-law. But my mother-in-law wouldn't spill the beans about my whereabouts. After pressing her for about an hour, she finally explained. My husband then realized I had left due to issues with my mother-in-law and quickly tried to contact me. There were several missed calls, but considering my husband didn't show up at my workplace, I appreciated his understanding of my situation. Feeling guilty about making him worry, I called him back. Without delay, my husband answered, asking what had happened. I was hesitant about whether to be honest about everything, but my husband's persistence made me spill the truth. I briefly explained what my mother-in-law had done to me, and I could tell from my husband's voice that he was furious. He wanted to talk as soon as I finished work. After locking up the cafe and office, I headed home. I had never seen my husband this mad before. Thus, the thought of meeting my husband in this state was intimidating. I reached home around 10 p.m. and noticed that only the lights on the first floor were on. My husband and my mother-in-law must be in the living room. When I tried to unlock the door, my key wouldn't fit. I knocked at the door, and my husband came out to unlock the door. As I entered the living room, there sat my mother-in-law with a sulky expression. Apparently, after I left, she had changed the locks without telling anyone. My husband hadn't noticed earlier since the door was unlocked when he got back from his trip. My husband immediately wanted to hear the whole story from me, so I told him about the incidents over the past week. I explained how my mother-in-law suddenly became overbearing, wouldn't listen during our talks, and went as far as spreading lies about me to the neighbors. Every time I pointed this out, she would accuse me of lying. However, when my husband insisted on hearing everything, she just went silent. After I finished speaking, it was my mother-in-law's turn. My mother-in-law claimed I was violent towards her and wouldn't stop, even when she asked me to. She mentioned she had talked with neighbors, but the harassment from me only seemed to increase. She even began to say that if the neighbors were asked, they would know all about my doings. I wondered what made my mother-in-law so confident to make such outrageous claims. The conversation seemed to be going in circles, and there was no clear conclusion. So, I decided to show something to my husband. I had been collecting video and audio footage. With just a few taps on my smartphone, I could record instantly, and over the past week, I had recorded every time my mother-in-law made snide remarks. Whenever I had the chance, I would prop up my phone to capture my mother-in-law harassing me on video. The footage showed my mother-in-law yelling at me to make dinner and even calling me defective for not having children. Seeing this, my husband was furious, his face turning bright red. On the contrary, my mother-in-law looked pale as if she had seen a ghost. In a desperate attempt to save face, she was like, "This isn't right, Catherine. It's just a misunderstanding. It seems like I'm the bad one, but that's because you cut out the parts where you were being mean. In reality, you've done much worse to me." But my husband, who had experience with video editing, wasn't convinced. If the video had been edited unnaturally, he would have noticed right away. It seemed like my husband completely trusted me. Just as I hoped, he began considering living separately from my mother-in-law. Despite my mother-in-law's vehement objections, my husband seemed firm in his decision. For the time being, I decided to stay at an office. During this period, we discussed whether to live separately and how to go about it if we decided to. Eventually, a conclusion was reached. We were going to send my mother-in-law to a nursing home. We had been against this idea before we moved in together. It seemed like a secure environment where she'd be looked after 24/7. However, my mother-in-law had always said she didn't want to go into a facility. I thought that if she did, it would be incredibly stressful for her. But my husband revealed he had been considering this option for a while. With my mother-in-law's bad knee and both of us working, we just couldn't give her the attention she needed. He believed that the only way to ensure her safety was for her to be in a facility. However, my mother-in-law really pleaded not to be put in a facility, but my husband didn't budge. My husband isn't someone who shows it much, but he really adores me. I started dating him due to his relentless pursuit, and from the time we began our relationship to our marriage, things moved incredibly fast. After getting married, my husband was always helpful around the house and always seemed to put me first. So, I kind of saw it coming when he took my side over my mother-in-law's. My mother-in-law apparently hadn't noticed and assumed my husband would be on her side. But when she was told my mother-in-law'd be placed in a facility, she quickly apologized to me. However, my husband was still upset and didn't listen to anything my mother-in-law said. During all this, I was focusing on running my cafe. Initially open from lunchtime, I began opening it for breakfast and started serving alcohol in the evenings. To my surprise, the number of customers nearly doubled. I was so shocked by the huge response that I inadvertently shared the news with my mother-in-law. I was like, "Thanks to you kicking me out, the cafe is doing better than ever. Thanks for giving me this opportunity," but it seemed to come off as sarcasm to my mother-in-law. I'll never forget the look on my mother-in-law's face when I told her about the cafe's success. Her lips were tight and her eyes weren't smiling. In the end, we had my mother-in-law stay at the closest senior facility. Although the cost was higher compared to other places, it was known for its excellent services. Despite the past tensions, I never wished any ill on my mother-in-law. I'm actually thankful for her raising my husband to be the man he is. So when it came to choosing a facility for her, I wanted to find the best possible place. Being somewhat forced into the facility, I heard my mother-in-law was causing a lot of trouble there. Whenever I visited, I was told she had issues with other residents. The reasons for these disputes were minor things, like making eye contact or speaking too loudly. She often clashed with other residents, but fortunately, it never reached a point where they'd kick her out. They ended up isolating her from the others. The staff kept me updated about my mother-in-law's situation. Initially, my mother-in-law was quite spirited, but about 6 months into her stay, I was told she seemed to lose her energy. She probably felt lonely without talking to others. Recently, with the help of the staff, I received a report that she's now able to converse well with other residents. However, it seems my mother-in-law's nature hasn't changed, and due to her bad attitude, she was evicted from the facility. Although she moved to another facility, she ended up isolated and her loneliness seemed to intensify, possibly leading to dementia. It's a bit sad that she had to be separated from her son, my husband. Still, if it ensures everyone's peace, it might be for the best. Now, I live in Europe with my husband. My husband, who had been traveling abroad more frequently for work, recently said he wouldn't be able to return home for about a month. Then, he suggested he'd like to take me abroad with him. I run a cafe and thought I couldn't possibly leave, but luckily 2 of my student workers were graduating, so I decided to close the cafe and follow my husband. I dreamed of running a restaurant abroad and set off for Europe. At first, the language barrier was tough, and I mostly stayed home. But after making friends in the neighborhood, my perspective changed. A friend got me a job at the local grocery store, and gradually, I was able to communicate better. Eventually, I decided to open a small cafe in a corner of a town. We had a house back in Oregon which was still being mortgaged. We contemplated whether to sell it or not, but due to some false rumors in the neighborhood, we sold it to fund the new cafe. Thanks to the many acquaintances I'd made, a lot of people visited on the opening day. It was also promoted on social media as a homey cafe run by an American, and some customers even came all the way from the US. The reason I started the cafe was that I managed to get permanent residency in Europe. The reason my husband was traveling more was that he was getting more work opportunities abroad than in the US. My husband's company proposed relocating him to their branch in Europe, so we just ended up settling there. He eventually quit that job, but in his new job, he seems to be really shining. And is now earning about the same as I am. When we were like, we've settled down here in Europe, and with both of us, it's hard to figure out where to use our money. To our surprise, we found out we were expecting. We were told natural conception would be difficult, but it feels like a gift from above. Raising a child will be challenging, but I believe my husband and I will manage. We can't wait to meet our baby, even though the due date is a way off. The town I live in is filled with friendly folks, and when I shared the news of my pregnancy, everyone was genuinely thrilled for me. I believe that in this environment, our child will surely have a happy life.